Hello and welcome. I'm Pastor Eric Kleinschmidt from Redeemer Lutheran Church in Highland, Indiana, coming to you from my home. This is our first attempt at recording and broadcasting our regular Sunday morning Bible classes to our YouTube channel and other social media platforms. Because we are in another 30 days of this COVID-19 quarantine, this is going to have to be the way in which we do Bible class for a while. And for that reason, I want to try to finish up our study on Leviticus. We're at the last chapter, and then we'll start something new for the weeks to come, hopefully. I don't know when we're able to come back together at church, if we will continue this study that we begin here, or if we'll just do something else. So much is up in the air right now. But for now, we're going to try to continue to provide these Bible study opportunities for you to follow along at home. And we really want to finish up this last chapter of Leviticus before we move on to anything else. So please bear with me, as all of this is very, very new to me. I'm hoping that we don't have too many technical difficulties as we go along, but we're bound to have them. And please forgive me if this doesn't look as smooth and as polished as some of the other talking heads that you perhaps have graced your screen in the past several weeks. Hope you're all doing very well. Let's get started. We are going to be talking about Leviticus chapter 27, and if you have a Bible at home, certainly invite you to open up to that. I'm going to try to get this to come up here. Should scroll right there. So let's go back to Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 27. I'm just using BibleGateway.com here, and hopefully this will scroll as I'm talking, and we can continue to come back to this, and you can follow along as I read. However, if you have a Bible at home, that's going to be a lot easier. Even if it's not the English Standard Version, which is what I'll be using here, you can still follow along pretty easily. Just realize that some of the words may be a little bit different. Just a word about where we have been. In the whole study of Leviticus, we have really seen that, well, there's two things that come through in Leviticus. One is that God gives all these rules about what they are to do and how they are to do them for worship and sacrifice and keeping their end of the covenant. God gives all these rules to the people for two specific reasons, primarily. First, that they would realize that He is holy, and they, as His people, must also be holy if they desire to be with Him. That's why these rules are so exact. And we saw with Nadab and Abihu that when God's rules aren't followed exactly, death is the only result. It's not that God is angry and He likes to kill things. It's that there is no other option. If He is the God of life and you are not with Him in His holiness, then the only other option is death. And we see that sort of judgment played out throughout the Old Testament and also on the day of judgment. You're either with God or you're without Him. You're either with the God of life or you will die and die eternally. Okay? The second thing that God does throughout Leviticus and really the Old Testament in giving all these laws, it really reinforces the people that they cannot keep them. They cannot be as perfect as God requires them to be. And so that points them ahead to one who can. That, of course, is Jesus, who is like them, who has the same flesh, is of the dirt as they are, and yet is also God. And in His perfection, He is able to do what the people of Israel cannot do. So Christ keeps the covenant of righteousness on their behalf, and then at the cross He takes their iniquity, their breaking of that covenant, and He gives them His holiness and His keeping of that covenant, and then He makes everything reconciled once again, that people can be with God, that there is now no separation and no condemnation for them. So as we look at the Old Testament, we read all those laws, they really do point us ahead to Jesus, so that when Jesus finally comes and when the people see Him and who are familiar with their Old Testament history and the scriptures, they would have recognized Him. Such an amazing import for us in this Holy Week as we vacillate between those who at a moment glimpse Jesus and see him as the Messiah that has been promised for all these years, and then also completely miss him and crucify him on Good Friday. And yet that's what he came to do. So wonderful beginning to our Holy Week as we round out Leviticus, and we see God's grace and his direction and pointing ahead towards Jesus. One thing that we want to talk about is in the previous chapters, we spent a lot of time on the year of Jubilee and also the Sabbath, that God requires his people to rest. That's really a model after the first 6 days of creation, that God works on 6 days, on the seventh he rests. And so he commands that we do that. We looked at the word for Jubilee. We looked at the word for Sabbath. One of the things that we found was that it was tied to a proclamation, a reading of the word. We aren't just meant to sit at home and do nothing. Rather, we are to rest in God's word. So even today, not having public or in-person church service, it's not a day to just say, oh, well, we won't spend any time in God's word. No, to rest, to Sabbath, to have joy is really to rest in the Lord's word, especially one day a week. The year Jubilee had extra implications for the nation of Israel. They were to free slaves. They were to forgive debt. They were to return land back to the original owner. That land is very important because in many cases, God actually upholds the land more than he upholds the people. In some of the cases, God actually promises Israel that if they don't keep his commandments, that the land will vomit them out, that God will Sabbath the land, that he will let the land rest from their torment. So the land is really kind of more important than the people in a lot of ways. Interesting, when we talked about slavery, and that was a very difficult passage that I don't have a really good answer for you. Other than that, when we have a difficult text where God seemingly allows for slavery, we need to understand the context. We need to understand that in most cases, God is talking about people who have sold themselves of their own volition, that I owed somebody money, couldn't pay it back, so I will voluntarily work for them for a set number of years. And God says that if that happens in the year of Jubilee, you have to forgive the debt, let them go free. However, in the previous chapter, we had a discussion about where God allows the Israelites to buy slaves from other nations around them. And we were really hoping that there would be something in there that would appease our more modern sensibilities about equality and things like that. It's just not there as much as we would like. And that's something that we continue to wrestle with. We don't understand everything that God is trying to tell us. And so when we come up with those difficult passages, we want to look at the context. We also want to look at the word. When we looked at that word for property, when talking about this person from another culture who may have sold themselves voluntarily to the Israelites, not like if they've been captured in war, but we don't know for sure. But when they've done that, God says that they are property, but his word for that is that they are tied to the land. And again, the land is the utmost concern of God. So in tying these people to the land, he's really elevating them even in their diminished status socially. We see throughout Leviticus that God puts a lot of rules and regulations about how you are to treat people better than what you really need to in society. So society says you can treat them at this level, but God says you have to treat them up here. And when he talks about slaves or servants, he says if these people are going to be in your home and you're going to do this, you have to make them family. And so they're included in a lot of the rites and a lot of the rituals and a lot of the blessings that come to the Israelites. Even though they might have thought of them as second-class citizens, God puts them on the same level. He doesn't seem to condone slavery in other places, and certainly we understand the equality of everybody that came from Adam and Eve, regardless of ethnic origin, color of their skin, any of that sort of thing. And Jesus died for them all, so Jesus puts them on the same level. All of those things really come to play. So we look at the context, we look at the word. That's where the Exodus chapter 21 comes into play. Let me see if I can transition back to there. In one place in Leviticus, it seems that God allows for the ownership of slaves, and it's like, okay, well, does that mean that you can go and conquer people and do that sort of thing? And then you really come to Exodus 21, verse 16. I'll try to highlight it here. Whoever steals a man and sells him, that's going to be there, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. There really is no greater condemnation than that God says, if you do this, you're going to be put to death. You're going to be cut off from the covenant. You are cast out. Don't do this. And so all those things considered, when we come to that difficult passage in Leviticus, I think it's Leviticus 26, where it talks about you may buy slaves from other nations and they shall be your property, that we have to understand it in the greater understanding of the scriptures. And in the end, I still can't give you a really satisfactory answer that says this was not okay. But I definitely am of the opinion that it does not condone what we saw in our own country and what we've seen in other countries and still happening in some places today. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better handle on that. It's okay not to know everything about the scriptures. We shouldn't expect to know everything about the scriptures. After all, they were written by God. He inspired the men to write them. And yet it comes from a wisdom that is so far beyond us, and we're still trying to figure things out. And every time we have a class, and every time I get to teach a class like this, it's really a joy to get to know God in a different way, because I see something I never saw before, and I learn so much from teaching. All right, let's go back for a moment. Leviticus 27. This really is the final word of God for the people in this chapter before we begin Numbers, of course. It really is kind of wrapping things up. God is reiterating a lot of the things he said before. He reiterates the covenant. And before he lets the people kind of move on, he is going to reiterate a lot of stuff about the sanctuary, about the priests, about his sacrifices, things like that. And so let's get started in the text. Again, we are in Leviticus chapter 27. Let's transition right back to there and come here. So I'm going to read along, and I'll stop and offer commentary like I do in class normally. And you can, hopefully this will scroll as I continue talking, and hopefully you can see me down there in the corner and I'm not too distracting. Leviticus chapter 27. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuation of persons, then the valuation of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old shall be 50 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. If the person is female, the valuation shall be 30 shekels." And that's where we say, oh, so God values women less than he values men. Not so much. Remember that God made them male and female. They both come from the same dirt. He puts them together as one flesh. Jesus himself atones for the sins of all people, not only males but also females. Rather, it was a culture that valuated males more than females, and in a lot of cases rightly so, because you had at that time an agrarian economy. You had people that required to work with their hands day in and day out, most of the time spent tilling the land, getting food, and then you had the role of wife and mother that took care of children or was pregnant a lot of the time too. So we all look at that today as saying, oh, that's so antiquated and everything. But if we had an apocalypse, many things would go back to being that way. That a woman who is carrying a child should not be expected to work out in the fields. There was a man that is not carrying the child. He should be out there tilling the ground and sweating under the sun. Okay, so we have here a little bit of a cultural thing, but also a really different roles that God has given us, and it's only our own sinfulness that imagines that different roles mean inequality. That's something that we're placing over that text. God values us, male and female. He created them in his own image. He created them, and Jesus atones for us all. So different does not mean unequal. So in this case, when we're looking at people and their valuation in society, and we take all that into context, that a man of working age is of the most valuable. Fighting men also would be that. Okay? Verse 5, if the person is from 5 years old up to 20 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 20 shekels and for a female 10 shekels. Okay, so they're not of fighting age, and yet they will grow up to be in those roles. So again, there is a disparity there, but really not that big of a disparity. If the person is from a month old up to 5 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 5 shekels of silver. For a female, the valuation shall be 3 shekels of silver. If the person is 60 years old or over, then the valuation for a male shall be 15 shekels, and for a female, 10 shekels. So there, despite all the other places in the scriptures where God values old age, experience, the traditions of the elders, these are very important people within the community. God has just said that you should stand up before the gray-haired one. You should show them their proper respect and treat them with the respect that they have deserved simply by being old and experienced. And yet here in this understanding of value in terms of society, they're not of working age anymore, and so their valuation is less. If someone is too poor to pay the valuation, then he shall be made to stand before the priest, and the priest shall value him. The priest shall value him according to what the valuer can afford. So here's something that we see. God is concerned about the poor and those who are not as successfully or financially secure as others. We saw that he has provided grain for them by requiring the farmers not to reap up to the edges of their farmers, to leave them for the poor and the sojourner. So we see that God has a sort of public assistance program, if you will, in preparation. Here we see that God understands that could be a lot for some people, and so he says there is some leeway here, and he puts the priests to speak for him in that respect. What's going on here at all in the first place? Like, what are you vowing a person? Well, these are not your regular offerings to the Lord. These are more for deliverance in a time of trouble, for special blessing. At our own church, you might consider them special Thanksgiving offerings, like those cards that we have in the pews. That's kind of what this was for. We see this with Hannah and Samuel, that she vows her son to the Lord's service if he would be born to her, and she upholds that vow. So we do see that as happening. So this is not an everyday occurrence, but if it does happen, God has set some rules in that place, and those rules include allowing for people that may have made a vow and then not been able to really pay it. In addition to vowing a person as a gift to God, you could also do an animal. If the vow is an animal that he may be offered as an offering to the Lord, all of it that he gives to the Lord is holy. He shall not exchange it or make a substitute for it, good for bad, bad for good. If he does in fact substitute one animal for another, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. Here's where we see a first glimpse of an abuse that may have happened. We certainly understand this. Human nature, that people say, oh, well, if God helps me out, then I will give my prized donkey as a sacrifice to God. And then God actually comes through, and the guy is like, well, I got this other donkey out back that's a little bit older that I don't like as much. What difference does it really make to God, right? Why can't I just give him that one and keep the good one for myself? Well, God knew that this was part of the sinful human nature, and so he actually says, if you try to do that, the priests are going to consider both animals to be holy and both animals. So if you're going to try to save one by substituting another, you're going to lose both. Because God doesn't accept less than our best in that respect. Because again, these sacrifices, these vows were stand-ins for God's perfect Son until God's perfect Son arrives down the line. So you can't say, well, Jesus is really great and really good, but I got, Jehoshaphat over here that I'd like to substitute because, it's got to be the same, right? God's like, no, there is only one Jesus. There is only one holiness, and you either have it or you don't. So if you're going to try to save a buck by giving me the least of your flock or a lesser, then you're going to lose both of them. So we see a little bit of abuse that's happening already in God's holy people, and this is something that will continue on and on and on. It's one of the reasons why God, Jesus, when he is in the flesh and in Jerusalem, he cleanses the temple because these abuses had crept in. All right. So he may not make a substitute for it if they shall be both be holy if he tries. Verse 11, and if it is any unclean animal that may not be offered as an offering to the Lord, then he shall stand before the animal before the priest. The priest shall value it as either good or bad, and the priest values it, so it shall be. But if he wishes to redeem it, he shall add a fifth to the valuation. So here's something interesting that happens. So if they bring an unclean animal that may not be used as a sacrifice, that presumably the temple, the priests, would then sell that animal and use the money to pay for the upkeep of God's house. However, the man or the woman that brought it is allowed to redeem it. That is, to buy it back. And that word redeem, to buy back, it really has its full import here. And if you're going to buy it back from God, it's going to cost you an extra fifth of the price. That is to compensate God for the loss of his goods because you gave it to him. So if you give your prized donkey and then you say, well, I really don't want to lose that, so I'll give it to God, and then I'd really like to have it back. And they say, okay, well, so then I'm not just giving to God and then taking it back. God still comes out ahead on the deal, as is proper. So then it really is an offering, and you don't just vow things to God willy-nilly because you know that it's not going to make a difference in the end. So you shall add a fifth to its valuation. When a man dedicates his house as a holy gift to the Lord, the priest shall value it as either good or bad. As the priest values it, so shall it stand. And if the donor wishes to redeem his house, he shall add a fifth to the valuation price, and it shall be his. So the same deal. If a man dedicates to the Lord part of the land that is his possession, then the valuation shall be in proportion to its seed. An omer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. Don't even ask me how much that is or how big that is. I have no idea. I can tell you about acreage or something like that, but I have no idea how much an omer of barley seed covers. If he dedicates his field from the year of Jubilee, the valuation shall stand. But if he dedicates his field after the Jubilee, then the priest shall calculate the price according to the years that remain until the year of Jubilee, and a deduction shall be made from the valuation. And if he who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, then he shall add a fifth to its valuation price, and it shall remain his. But if he does not wish to redeem the field, or if he has sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed any more. But the field, when it is released in the Jubilee, shall be a holy gift to the Lord, like a field that has been devoted. The priest shall be in possession of it. If he dedicates to the Lord a field that he has bought, which is not part of his possession, then the priest shall calculate the amount to the valuation for it up to the year of Jubilee, and the man shall give the valuation on that day as a holy gift to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return to him from whom it was bought, to whom the land belongs as possession. Every valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. 20 gerahs shall make a shekel. Again, I have no idea what a gerah is. That's why you need a good study Bible, and you can look up what a gerah is. But here's what we saw happening once again. We saw abuse creeping in. the year of Jubilee, where you're supposed to give back everything back to the land, the tribe that it was from, meant that if, okay, well, I'm going to sell my land to you, and then it's 2 years until the year of Jubilee, so I know that in 2 years I'm going to get my land back. Well, I'm not going to do that. If you're buying it, you don't want to do that. You want to wait until just after the Jubilee, and then you know that you've got 45 years to work that land before you even have to think about giving it back. Again, people trying to get around giving to the Lord and doing what the Lord asked. In class, the last time we had class, we even talked about how within the Jewish understanding of year of Jubilees, they even had a loophole by which you could give your debt over to the council, and then the council could collect it, even though you as a person were supposed to forgive that debt because of the year of Jubilees. That the Bible doesn't say anything about a council forgiving the year of Jubilee debt, so you could do this. You had to fill out a form. Now the form's even available online. Weird stuff, but it's all part of the same selfish spirit of people to try to get around giving to the Lord a gift in thanksgiving. And it's still a part of us today, and it still has to do with our stewardship today. And we'll see that, and we'll talk more about that as we get to the end of this text. All right. But a firstborn of animals, which as a firstborn belongs to the Lord. Remember, all of the firstborn of both man and beast were meant to be the Lord, dedicated to the Lord, because again, they're pointing ahead to Christ, the firstborn of the dead, the only Son of God, the firstborn of Mary. So all the firstborn are pictures of Jesus. They're pointing ahead to Jesus. And so the firstborn of the animal already belongs to the Lord. So you can't dedicate it to him. It's already his. You're trying to give him something that he already owns. So whether it's an ox or a sheep, it's already the Lord's. If it's an unclean animal, he shall buy it back at the valuation and add a fifth to it. Or if it is not redeemed, it shall be sold at the valuation. Again, you can give it away, but you really can't, dedicate it to the Lord because it's already his. But no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that he has, whether man or beast, or of his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No one devoted, who is to be devoted for destruction for mankind, shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. And we'll see that where God devotes things to destruction when the people of Israel come into the land of Canaan. And again, this is a picture of judgment. That you're either with God or without God. It's not that God hates the people of Canaan. These were people that descended from Adam and Eve like everybody else. The only difference is that they gave up the true God in favor of idols. So when the children of the true God come into the land and there is a contest between Yahweh and Baal or whomever else, God decides that battle definitively, that there is life and that there is death. He only gives the people of Israel into the hand of their enemies when they have left the covenant and when they have disobeyed him. He is reminding them that without him there is no life, there is only death. And all that's pointing ahead to Judgment Day at the end of Revelation. Verse 30, every tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. Remember a couple chapters ago we had all these requirements about when you could harvest the tree, that you had to let it grow by itself for so many years, and then in the 5th year you just had to let it sit there, and then finally you could harvest it after that. Again, this is why you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees that had to keep all these things straight, and that's why they devoted their entire life to them. Because I read that maybe a month ago, and I've already forgotten how many years you're supposed to let it lie fallow, and then what year you have to give all the fruit to the Lord, and what year you can graze but not sell any of it. I mean, I don't remember all that. And your common Hebrew didn't remember that either. And that's why they had the Pharisees and the Sadducees who devoted their entire life to keeping those things straight and then letting you know. And that's why they were so widely honored within society. But then the abuses crept in, obviously, and so then there was resentment, and then you have Jesus coming, and he's pointing out the differences between what they should be doing and what they are doing. So it's a real big setup. But at their outset, these were very important people that kept track of the holiness codes of God, and were very important because small deviations had big consequences, because God is perfect, because God is holy, and so his people needed to be perfect and holy. Thankfully, Jesus is perfect and holy for us, so we don't have to worry about whether we're one gerah short in what we're bringing to God. Christ covers all. He's a perfect sacrifice, and he's a perfect redeemer who has bought us back. And thank God for that. We don't have to keep track of all this anymore. I wouldn't want to be a pastor if I had to keep track of what sacrifice goes here and what part goes where. No, thank you. Let's continue on. 32. Every tithe of the herds and the flocks, every 10th animal that all pass under the herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good and bad, neither shall he make a substitute for it. If he does substitute for it, then both in the substitute shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. So every 10th animal that passes through the gate belongs to the Lord. And he doesn't care if it's a good animal or not so great animal. God doesn't care. He's just saying they all belong to me, to remind them that none of this is yours. I've given it all to you, and so I'm asking for a 10th back. And here's where we get tithe, that 10th. It's a requirement here in the Old Testament. Doesn't really carry over into the New. There's different regulations given for our offerings in the New Testament, that we give of our first fruits. That's an Old Testament one. That we give cheerfully, that we give sacrificially, that we give regularly, that we give discreetly. All of those things. 10th is a nice percentage to shoot for most people. But for some people, 20% would be giving sacrificially. For some people, 5%. 2% would be giving sacrificially. So we really can't say that, hey, if you're not giving 10%, you're not upholding your deal. It's something that each person has to consider in their own heart what they shall give to the Lord, and we do so out of thanksgiving. But God is saying that everything I've given you is a gift. I'm only asking for a portion of it back. You can't substitute, make no differentiations between them. And remember who gave them to you. 34, the last verse in Leviticus. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. So remember, here we see that the flow, again, it comes from God. Moses is speaking as God. He speaks through Aaron at some times, but Moses is usually the one that tells Aaron to tell the people or tell the priest what to do. So we see that flow that comes there, and Moses is in that position of speaking for God, and he saw God face to face, and God has said, my words will be in your mouth, and you will be as God to the people. So this is one of the big reasons why Moses is such a highly revered figure in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well, because there was nobody who saw what Moses saw and did what Moses did. So that brings us to the end of Leviticus. A couple of things that we want to go back and talk about. First and foremost, when we have that dedication, we might say, well, how does this really play out? So if a man dedicates the Lord part of his possession or his house, those sorts of things, we were talking about the different types of abuses that kind of arose from people, faithful Jews who were trying to keep the law, but then would find these loopholes here and there and would take advantage of them. And we have one of those in Mark chapter 7. So if you'd like to turn there, or you can just follow me here as we transition over to Mark chapter 7. Let's see. Jesus is having a confrontation with the Pharisees. They noticed that his disciples did not wash their hands in the ritual washing before they sat down to eat. This was not, they didn't, wash off the coronavirus here before they ate, something you should be doing anyway. This, again, was a requirement in the Old Testament of all the things that they had to ritually wash before they would partake of them. Some of that does have the added benefit of being for hygiene and cleanliness, but a lot of it was just meant to separate the people of God apart from everyone else. And this washing over and over and over again, and everything that was holy and dedicated to the Lord, certainly does point us ahead to baptism, point us ahead to when God washes us with his water and his word, and we are brought into his family, we are part of his people, we are set apart from the world we live in. So Jesus and the Pharisees are having this confrontation, and then we get down here, what defiles a person? Verse 14. So Mark 7:14. And he called the people to him again and said to them, Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside of a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he said to them, Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. So there's a big thing that happens right there, that Jesus says, hey, you don't have to worry about eating that pork taco. Have at it, okay? Actually, I'm not sure how much they would have really wanted to eat pork anyway, but God declares all things clean, all foods clean. He does this with Peter later on too. He has to reiterate it because it becomes such a problem in the New Testament between Jewish converts to Christianity and Gentile converts to Christianity. They didn't know what they could and couldn't bring to the church potluck. And so several of our New Testament epistles are Paul sorting this out to them. And Peter has the vision where the sheet is lowered down and he's told to rise and eat, and he says, no, I've never eaten anything unclean. And God says, what God has called clean, do not call common. That go ahead and eat it. I've made them all. It's fine. So have at it. All right, but Jesus did it first. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Okay, so then we have the Syrophoenician woman's faith, right? Okay, we have that. Jesus heals a deaf man. Oh, I think I got the wrong text here. Oh, okay. Hold on. So, I want the parallel. Let's see if this works here. We want to go to Matthew 15. All right. Make sure that came up. Okay. Come down. Traditions and commandments. Sorry, I was looking up the parallel text. Okay, here we go. Matthew 15. The Pharisees and the scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. He answered them, and why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded, honor your father and your mother. Whoever reviles his father and mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father. For the sake of your tradition you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching us doctrines, the commandments of men. So here we see those people getting around that requirement to, I'm not sure what that was. Apparently when I move certain ways, I get this red light that comes in. People trying to get around this requirement of giving to God, or actually giving to God what they should have honored their parents with. So they're trying to get around the fourth commandment by saying, well, I'm doing something even more holy and I'm giving it to God. So I'm declaring it Corban. I'm saying that, oh, whatever I would have owed to you, I'm giving it to God. And then I get the benefit of being so devout and holy, and you really can't complain about it because I've given it to God. I didn't take it and squander it at the casino or do anything like that. No, I've given it to God, and therefore you have to be okay with it. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not how this works. You think you're keeping the law, but you've created your own laws, and you've missed everything that God has given you. You've missed the spirit of the law. You've missed actually caring for your neighbor. You think that you're doing what's right, but you're following a religion of your own creation rather than what the faith that God has given you. So we see this in Jesus' time as people are trying to use their piety to get around doing what God would actually have them do. And Jesus is routinely confronting the Pharisees and the Sadducees on these sorts of issues, that they have abused what God has put down. And it's one of the things that still happens today. It's one of the reasons why the Reformation happened. It's one of the reasons why Lutherans today are so adamant about certain things, that we want to get back and we want to keep what God has given us, and not something that we've created on our own as human beings. So again, if you want to read more about Corban and trying to get around that, it's Matthew 15, not Mark. Mark was a parallel text. Okay, Leviticus, as we ended up at the end. Let's see here. Let's go. So what do we have for applications today? Now that we've finished this whole study on Leviticus, what can we actually come back to for us Christians today? One of the big things is stewardship. The first video that I'm ever doing in Bible study, and it's going to be about stewardship. Oh, great, But that's really what these vows are for. God sets in place this idea of giving to Him through the temple as a way of providing for His house. Does God need those offerings? No, He doesn't. God is not sitting up there bored, waiting for somebody to praise Him, waiting for somebody to give Him $20. He has no need for those things. The cattle, 1,000 hills are mine, God says. I don't need this stuff. It's more, an offering is a mark of faith of the one who's giving them. Imagine that if you took 10% of your paycheck and in cash, okay, and you went home right after you got paid on Friday, and you took that $200, $300, $500, whatever it happens to be for you, I have no idea, and you went out in the backyard and burned it before you paid your bills, before you bought groceries, before you did anything else with that. You took 10% of what you had earned with your own sweat and blood, but you know that everything you have is a gift from God, and so you take 10% of it out in the backyard and you burned it. People in this world think that to be absolutely ridiculous, because even if you think about giving it an offering, let's say you're not going to give it, you're not going to burn it, you're going to bring it to church, you're going to put it in an offering plate, or you're going to choose a charity and you're going to give it to them, right? They would still say, why are you doing that before you pay bills? Before you know if you're going to have enough money for groceries? Before you know if your car is going to break down? Why not wait until you get paid the next time, and then if you have money left over, give that to God? Well, because that doesn't take any faith. First fruits giving, that idea of giving to God first before any use, is really a mark of faith, and that's why God calls us to give that way. The Israelites didn't know the future any more than we do in that respect, and so that first fruits giving is still a big part of it. The other thing about it is that those offerings are meant to be out of thanksgiving, that it's not trying to buy off God. It's not paying our dues. Some dreadful language that I hear from so many Lutherans. Oh yeah, I gotta pay my dues. Who taught you about offerings? That's so depressing. We give offerings because we're thankful, because we're abounding in joy for what God has given us. And if God has given us a special blessing, or if we're more thankful for a blessing for whatever reason this week than we were last week, that should be reflected in our offering. If we get a raise, if we get a bonus, if we get a gift, if we anything, there should be joy behind that giving. That's hard to do when you're giving sacrificially, absolutely. And that's part of the difficulty of walking the path of Jesus, is to give sacrificially and also give cheerfully, for God loves a cheerful giver. But we always give out of thanksgiving, and we always give our first fruits, and we always give our best. You can't substitute, something that's lesser for something that's better. When I was younger, I felt guilty about giving God wrinkly dollar bills or tarnished coins when I had, bright, shiny new coins and crisp new dollars. Again, does God care? No, he doesn't need that money. The church doesn't care either. The church needs it to pay bills, to do its missions and ministries. But they don't care if it's an old wrinkly dollar or if it's a crisp brand new one. It spends the same. But in my mind, I was thinking, I want to give God my best. And so if these are the best dollar bills that I have, these are the ones that I should put in the offering plate. I suppose maybe that's a good attitude to have, but I just find it kind of funny these days. The other interesting thing is that throughout this end chapter of Leviticus, we talk about Redeemer, again, buying us back. We're still couched in those terms of slavery, although we are slaves to Christ. And Jesus owns us because he has purchased and won us. But again, remember the context that we were talking about slavery. They were not owned just as chattel. We're actually owned as family. And in the case of Jesus, he raises us even higher than family. And that language of Jesus purchases us. Our church is called Redeemer. So we are the ones purchased by Christ. And if you remember your small catechism, second article of the creed, right? You can probably maybe recite part of this, maybe all of it, I don't know. But I believe that Jesus Christ, true God, begotten of the Father from eternity, and also true man, born of the Virgin Mary, is my Lord, who has redeemed me, a lost and condemned person, purchased and won me from all sins, from death, and from the power of the devil, not with gold or silver, but with his holy precious blood, and with his innocent suffering and death. Purchased and won me with his precious blood and his innocent suffering and death. There's that language of redeemed, and it's all through this text, and it's all through the Christian faith and life. God redeems us, not as his property, but as his family. That goes back to Ruth, Boaz, all that great. That's good stuff too. Finally, and this is where I'm going to end today, that let's see if I can get out here. I'll do this first. All right. Church is a gift. God provides for his church through these offerings and through these vows and through these gifts to it. He doesn't need them up there in heaven, but yet his church does. Things in church wore out. Things had to be replaced. Remember when we talked about the building of the tabernacle, that this cost billions of dollars in today's money with all the gold and silver and finery. God doesn't need that, but it represents who lives there. It shows the value of what happens there. And all of that would have taken maintenance, and all of that maintenance and all of that whatever. It all takes money. Back then, the same way it does today. Okay? But can we worship and believe in God and go to heaven without a physical building? Absolutely we can. We're kind of doing that right now. Again, a fortuitous coincidence that this all comes together in this way. You don't need a big fancy building to worship God in. You don't need a pastor standing in front of you all the time to believe in God, to read his word, to rejoice in your baptism, to pray, and to receive the blessings of Christ's forgiveness of sins. You don't need a lot of the things that we've become accustomed to, buildings and hymnals and organ music. And I hesitate to say this because I'm afraid that people are going to take it the wrong way, but you really don't even need and absolutely require the sacrament of the altar. It's very important, and it's a great and incredible blessing. But Christ does not say, he who believes and is baptized and receives the sacrament on a regular basis will be saved. It's only our sinfulness then that goes like, well, then I don't have to take the sacrament, right? No. It's not a requirement. It's a gift. We don't have to go without the sacrament. We don't have to go without a church building. We don't have to go without a pastor of our own. They're gifts. There's something to rejoice in. And now that some of those things are being limited or taken away from us, maybe we're starting to appreciate them more. Maybe we're looking forward to being in worship together more than we have in a long time because we're not able to do that. I know that many of you long for the sacrament. We're trying to make that available as best we can. Low contact individuals, family groups, communing them in that way, but that's not the same as the full church communing together. And yet it's always the full church communing together, communion of saints, that we're never alone. We're with angels and archangels wherever Christ is present in his body and blood. But there is something beneficial and beautiful about being there with your whole church, communing. And maybe this abstinence for a time from that will help us appreciate it more. But we should not go, well, we don't really need it. We went without it. We don't really need it. We don't need a church building. We can just do everything online. We don't really need our pastor of our own. We could watch some other guy that can do a live stream much more fancy than Pastor Eric can. But it's joy when we don't have to do those things, when we get to do them because God gifts them to us and they are blessings. So God gives us great and many blessings, not the least of which are the ability to come together with other Christians on a regular basis, on a Sabbath, rest weekly, to rest in his word, to give thanksgiving of our offerings of time, talent, and treasure, and our songs and our praises, to pray for our neighbor, to be there, to support them, to have our sins forgiven, to remember our baptism, to receive Christ's body and blood and commune with the angels and archangels. All those are gifts and a great thing to rejoice in. That concludes our study of Leviticus. Hopefully this wasn't too long. I have no idea how long it is because there's nothing on here that tells me how long I've been recording. Oh wait, no, it's down there at the bottom, 53 minutes. All right. Hopefully this all works out just fine. And thank you for watching. Thank you for studying at home. And we'll see what the weeks ahead bring. God bless you and stay safe, and hope to see you again in worship all together very soon. We continue to pray for that day, and we continue to rejoice. God's blessings.